Whereupon the father of one Stephen, a Jew, converted to the Christian faith, being sore troubled that his son had turned Christian, and hearing what the king had done in such like matters, presented to him 60 marks of silver, conditionally that he should enforce his son to return to his Jewish religion. Whereupon the young man was brought before the king, to whom he said, "Sirrah, your father here complains that without his license you have become a Christian. If this be true, I command you to return again to the religion of your nation, without any more ado." To whom the young man answered, "Your grace does not know yourself." Wherewith the king, being moved, said, "What? You insolent knave, should I jest with you? Get yourself gone quickly and fulfill my commandment, or by St. Luke's face I shall cause your eyes to be plucked out of your head." The young man, nothing dismayed by this, with a steady voice answered, "Truly I will not do it. But know for certain that if you were a good Christian, you would never have spoken such words. For it is the duty of a Christian to reduce those again to Christ who have departed from him, and not to separate them from him who are joined to him by faith." The king, being confounded by this, commanded the Jew to come forward and strike out one of his son's eyes. But the father, perceiving that the king could not persuade his son to abandon the Christian faith, demanded to have his money returned. To whom the king said that he had done so much as he had promised to do, that is, to persuade him as far as he could. And although, when he would have had the king go further in the matter, the king, to stop his mouth, returned back to him the 1/2 of his money, and kept the other half for himself, all which increased the just suspicion men had of his infidelity. By this history we may perceive what a prevailing engine the Jews' money is, both to force them into Christian kingdoms, though they are the most bitter, inveterate enemies of Christ himself, Christians, and Christianity, and how their money can induce even Christian princes to commit most unchristian and anti-Christian acts, and by threats and violence even force converted Christian Jews to renounce their Christianity and return to their former Jewish errors, which they had fully renounced. And do not they still work even by the same money engine, preferred by too many Christians even before Christ himself and Christianity? In the year of our Lord, 1145, during the reign of King Stephen, the Jews grew so presumptuous in England that they crucified a child named William in the city of Norwich, in defiance of the Christian religion, as Matthew Westminster, Flores Historiarum, Anno 1145, page 39. The Chronicle of Johannes Brompton, column 1148, Hoveden in his Polychronicon, Antoninus, the Magdeburg Centuries, Century 12, chapter 14, Mr. John Fox in his Acts and Monuments, 1640, volume 1, page 302, Richard Grafton in his Chronicle, page 46, Raphael Holinshed in his Chronicle, volume 3, page 56, and others jointly attest. Not long after this, in the year 1160, the 6th year of Henry II, they crucified another child at Gloucester, in contempt of Christ and his passion, as John Brompton's Chronicle records. Henry of Knighton de Eventibus Angliae, Book 1, column 2394. Polychronicon, Fox, Acts and Monuments, volume 1, page 302. Grafton in his Chronicle, page 46, and others recurred. And in the same king's reign, in the year 1181, upon the same account, the Jews on the feast of Easter murdered and crucified another child at St. Edmundsbury, called Robert, who was honorably buried soon after in the church of St. Edmunds, and grew famous for miracles there performed, as Gervase of Dorobernia relates in his chronicle, column 1458. What punishments were then inflicted on them for these murders and insolencies I do not record, perhaps because they purchased their peace with money. For I read that, in the year 1168, King Henry II, wanting money, banished the wealthiest of the Jews out of England and fined the rest of them 5,000 marks, most likely for these misdemeanors. The Jews, though there were a great multitude of them in England, in every quarter of the realm, had only one churchyard allowed them, and that at London, in which they were forced to bury all their dead bodies wherever they died, which being a great trouble and annoyance to them, they petitioned King Henry II, being at Stamford, in the year 1178 for a license to have churchyards outside the cities where they lived, in convenient places where they could purchase land in which to bury their dead, which he then granted them. It seems the Jews were then so hateful to the whole nation that they would not permit them to bury their dead bodies in any English soil, for fear of polluting it, nor near any Christian bodies, without the king's special license. King Richard I, being crowned king at London in the year of our Lord 1189, the chief Jews gathered together from all parts to his coronation, resolving to purchase the favor of the new king with large gifts and to have their former privileges confirmed, which they feared they might lose. But being suspected of sorcery and magic, the king by public proclamation prohibited all Jews from entering the church while he was being crowned, or his palace while he was feasting there. Nevertheless, some of the principal Jews secretly entered both the church and the palace, who, being discovered one after another, were beaten and driven out of the church and court by the king's officers and Christians. Whereupon the common people, then flocking in great multitudes to the king's coronation, fell upon the Jews standing in great numbers at the palace gate, first beating them with their fists, and then taking up clubs and stones, struck some of them and left others half dead. Among them was one called Benedict of York, who, being sorely wounded and terrified with the fear of death, received baptism from William, prior of St. Mary's of York, and thereby escaped the danger of death in the hands of his persecutors. Meanwhile, a great rumor spread throughout the city of London upon this occasion that the king had ordered that all the Jews should be banished and destroyed. Whereupon an infinite number of people, both from the city and from most counties of England, then assembled for the coronation, inflamed with a desire for plunder, taking up arms, fell violently upon the Jews, and slew and plundered them both in the streets and in their houses. Those who defended themselves for a time in strong houses that the mob could not enter were soon after burned and consumed together with their houses by the furious multitude, who set fire to their dwellings and burned down most of them. Most of their synagogues were defaced and destroyed, as Ralph de Sato records. The king, being informed of this while he was feasting with his nobles, sent Ralph de Glanville, then Chief Justice of the realm, a powerful and prudent man, together with other great nobles, to persuade and restrain these violent people. But all was in vain, for in so great a multitude no one would listen to their voices or respect their authority. But rather murmuring against them, they urged them to depart quickly. Whereupon they wisely withdrew, delaying the unbridled rage of the people, and the fury of the plunderers did not cease until the next day. As Henry of Huntingdon writes, it was allowed for a time that the king's majesty should be diminished in the beginnings of his reign, so that his hidden malice might be revealed. Yet the very next day the king sent his officers throughout the city and commanded that some of the offenders should be apprehended and brought before him. Of these, 3 were hanged by judgment of his court. One because he had stolen the goods of a certain Christian, and 2 because they had set fire to the city, by which the houses of Christians were burned. After this, the king sent for the man who, being a Jew, had been made a Christian, and demanded of him, in the presence of those who had seen him baptized, whether he truly had become a Christian. He answered that he was not, but that he had allowed the Christians to do to him what they wished so that he might escape death. Then the king demanded of the archbishop, in the presence of many archbishops and bishops, what ought to be done concerning him, who answered very discreetly, "If he will not be a servant of God, let him be a servant of the devil." And so he was returned to the Jewish law. In the meantime, the king sent out his writs throughout all the counties of England, forbidding that anyone should harm the Jews, but commanding that they should live in peace. After this was published, the Jews who were in the town of Dunstable, seeking to preserve their lives from the fury of the people, were converted to the Christian faith, baptized, and married their wives according to Christian custom. The same was done in many cities of England. And although the king by his proclamation had decreed peace to the Jews, nevertheless the fury against them, first kindled in London, did not truly arise from zeal for faith, but from greed, and burned fiercely in other parts of the land. For a certain Jew at Lynn, happening to be made a Christian, the Jews, accusing him as a violator of the law, seized an opportunity and attacked him with weapons as he passed through the city. He took refuge in a church, yet the raging Jews would not rest because of this, but with renewed fury began to attack the said church with great violence. Before they could enter, there arose a great outcry, and the Christians' assistance was summoned with loud shouts. This outcry and report inflamed the Christian people, and young men who were strangers, of whom a great number were present at that time, returning from foreign parts, ran armed to the church and bravely assaulted the Jews. Being unable to withstand the Christians' attack, the Jews presently took to flight. After this, the Christians assaulted them, plundered their houses, and then burned them with fire. Whereupon the young men who were strangers, having loaded themselves with plunder, departed quickly toward their ships and left. They should perhaps have been questioned and compelled to restore their booty by the king's officers. But when the inhabitants of the place were questioned about this by the king's officers, they transferred the blame to the strangers who had already departed, although they themselves were not entirely innocent, having taken up arms against the Jews at the first outcry. Yet they did nothing further against them out of fear of the king's discipline. Not long after, during Lent, there arose a new disturbance against the Jews at Stamford. For there being solemn fairs held there in Lent, the young men and soldiers who had taken upon them the sign of the cross, and were then ready to go to Jerusalem with the king, assembling there from various counties, disdained that the Jews, being enemies of the cross of Christ, possessed such great stores of goods and wealth, while they themselves had insufficient means to cover the necessary expenses of so great a journey. Imagining that they would do God good service if they assaulted these enemies, they boldly fell upon them, no one opposing them in so great an attempt, whereupon several of the Jews were slain, and the rest, being received into the castle, barely escaped with their lives, their goods being completely plundered, and the plunderers departing freely with their booty, none of them being questioned or punished by the king's discipline. The citizens of Lincoln, hearing what had been done to the Jews of Stamford, taking occasion and being encouraged by the example of others, were willing to do the same against them. Being assembled together against the Jews living among them, they became enraged against them. But the Jews, being made more cautious by the slaughter and damage suffered elsewhere, only a few of them suffering harm, The rest fled in time with their money into the royal fortress, and there secured themselves. In all other places wherever Jews were found, they were plundered and slain by the hands of pilgrims, who, traveling through England toward Jerusalem, resolved first to rise against the Jews before they invaded the Saracens. Whereupon all the Jews who were found in their own houses at Norwich were slain on the 8th of February, only a few of them escaping into the castle. At the same time, the nobles and gentry of Yorkshire, not fearing the king's proclamation, the Jews having by usury reduced them to extreme poverty, joined with some holy soldiers, they broke into the houses of the chief Jews, equal to the king's palace, slew their families, plundered their goods, and burned their homes in the night, then withdrew to their own houses under cover of darkness. After this, the common multitude made an assault upon the Jews, killing them without distinction of sex or age, except for a few who agreed to give their names to Christ in baptism in order to save their lives. On the 18th day of April, being Palm Sunday, the rest of the Jews in the city of York, men and women, besides their children, fearing the violence of the Christians, shut themselves up within the castle of York, by the will and consent of the guardian of the castle and of the sheriff. Having thus been received into the castle for their defense by the guardian and sheriff, they were afterward unwilling to be delivered up again, whereupon the sheriff and keeper of the castle, being greatly offended with them, assembled the soldiers of the county and the men of the city, urging them to free the castle from those Jews and to do their utmost to accomplish it. When they had assaulted the castle day and night, the Jews offered a great sum of money to save their lives, but all in vain. The people were so enraged against them that they would not accept it. Then a certain Jew, skilled in their law, stood up and said, "Men of Israel, listen to my counsel. It is better for us to die for our law than to fall into the hands of the enemies of our law, and our law itself commands the same." Whereupon all the Jews, men and women alike, consented to this counsel. Every father of a family, taking a sharp razor, first cut the throats of his own wife and children, then of himself, calling the dead bodies of those whom they had thus sacrificed to devils upon the castle wall in sight of the Christian people. After this, burning their rich garments and casting their golden vessels and jewels into privies so that the Christians might not be enriched by them, these murderers shut themselves up, and the rest whom they had killed in the king's house set it on fire, and so burned both themselves and it. After this, the citizens of York and the soldiers of the county, burning all the Jews' houses together, plundered their goods, seized their possessions for themselves, and burned all the charters of their debts. The king, being informed of this, was greatly offended both at the contempt of his royal proclamation and authority, and at the damage done to his exchequer, to which all the goods and debts of the Jews as usurers belonged. He therefore commanded his chancellor to inflict due punishment upon the authors of this sedition, whereupon, after Easter, the Bishop of Ely, the king's chancellor, gathering a great army together, came to York to apprehend those evildoers who had destroyed the Jews of the city. Understanding that this had been done by the command of the sheriff and the governor of the castle, he removed them both from their offices and took sureties from the citizens of the city to keep the peace of the king and kingdom, and to submit to the law in the king's court concerning the deaths of the Jews. He also commanded that the soldiers of the county who had taken part in the destruction of the Jews be apprehended. But the chief of them fled into Scotland and escaped, so that not all of them were put to death for this great massacre and riot. Henry of Huntingdon gives this judgment concerning the slaughter and popular uprisings against the Jews, that the zeal of the Christians against the Jews in England was not sincere, that is, not truly for the sake of faith, but arose either from rivalry and envy because of their prosperity, or from greed for their goods. The justice of God was not shown in approving such actions, but in rightly punishing them, so that by such means he might chastise the insolence of a faithless nation. He likewise adds that one John, a very bold Christian, fleeing from Stamford with many spoils taken from the Jews to Northampton, was there secretly slain by his host in order to seize his money, and was thrown outside the city during the night, the murderer fleeing immediately afterward. After this, through the dreams of old women and deceptive signs, the simple people, attributing to him the merits of a martyr, honored his burial with solemn vigils and gifts. This was ridiculed by wise men, yet it was acceptable to the clerks living there because of the profits involved, which the bishop, upon hearing of, immediately forbade and defiled the monuments of this false martyr, a practice continued by the foolishness of simple and greedy people. I wish no such plunderers as this might be sainted and worshipped in our age, as too many of them are even before their deaths, who will be canonized afterward, as well as this bold plunderer of the Jews, Mr. Fox, in his Acts and Monuments, Volume 1, page 305, relating the story of the massacres of the Jews this year out of the Chronicle of Westminster, says that there were no fewer than about 500 of the Jews destroyed at that time at York alone, besides those slaughtered in other places. So that this year, which the Jews took to be their Jubilee, was to them a year of confusion. Nor was this plague of theirs undeserved, for every year commonly their custom was to obtain some Christian man's child from the parents, and on Good Friday to crucify him in contempt of our religion. King Richard I, after his return out of the Holy Land in the year 1194, appointed justices, laws, and orders for preventing frauds and regulating the contracts of the Jews, both among themselves and between Christians and them, thus recorded at large by Roger of Hoveden, and briefly touched only by some others. All debts, pledges, mortgages, lands, houses, rents, and possessions of the Jews shall be registered. The Jew who conceals any of these shall forfeit to the king his body and the concealment, and likewise all his possessions and goods. Nor shall it ever be lawful for the Jew to recover the concealment. Likewise, 6 or 7 places shall be provided, in which they shall make all their contracts. And there shall be appointed 2 lawyers who are Christians, and 2 lawyers who are Jews, and 2 legal registrars. Before them and the clerks of William of the Church of St. Mary and William of Chimilly, all contracts shall be made, and charters shall be drawn up of their contracts by way of indenture. One part of the indenture shall remain with the Jew sealed with his seal, to whom the money is lent. The other part shall remain in the common chest, wherein there shall be 3 locks and keys, of which the Christians shall keep 1 key, the 2 Jews another, and the clerks of William of St. Mary's Church and William of Chimilly shall keep the 3rd. Moreover, there shall be 3 seals to it, and those who keep the seals shall place the seals thereon. Furthermore, the clerks of the said William and William shall keep a roll of the transcripts of all the charters, and as the charters shall be altered, so shall the roll likewise. For every charter there shall be 3 pence paid, one moiety by the Jew, and the other by him to whom the money is lent, whereof the 2 writers shall have 2 pence, and the keeper of the roll the 3rd. And from henceforth no contract shall be made with, nor payment made to the Jews, nor any alteration made of the charters, except before the said persons, or the greater part of them, if all of them cannot be present. And the aforesaid 2 Christians shall have 1 roll of the debts, or receipts of the payments made to the Jews, and the 2 Jews one, and the keeper of the roll one. Moreover, every Jew shall swear upon his roll that all his debts and pledges and rents and all his goods and possessions shall be enrolled, and that he shall conceal nothing, as is aforesaid. And if he shall be known that any one shall conceal anything, he shall secretly reveal it to the justices sent among them. And that they shall detect and show unto them all falsifiers or forgers of charters and clippers of money, wherever and whenever they shall know them, and likewise all false charters. By these strict political laws, the king and his officers knew the exact wealth, money, goods, debts, and real and personal property of every Jew, and in whose hands they were held, and thus could seize and dispose of them at pleasure, upon any real or alleged offenses or complaints against them. In the year of our Lord 1210, King John commanded all the Jews of both sexes throughout England to be arrested and imprisoned, and to be afflicted with the most grievous torments, so that he might satisfy his desire for their money. Some of them, being cruelly tortured, gave all that they had and promised more, so that by these means they might escape many kinds of torment. Among these was a Jew at Bristol, punished with various tortures, who, because he would neither redeem himself nor submit to any fine, the king commanded his tormentors that they should each day pull out one of his molar teeth until he would pay to the king 10,000 marks of silver. And when at last for 7 days' space they had pulled out 7 of his teeth with unbearable torment. And now on the 8th day the tormentors had begun the same work again. This Jew, an abundant provider for his profit, gave them the aforesaid money, so that he might save the 8th tooth to himself, the other 7 having been pulled out, who, with much more wisdom and less pain, might have done so earlier and preserved his 7 teeth, having but 8 in all. In the year 1222, at a council at Canterbury under Archbishop Stephen, a certain apostate Jew made a Christian into a deacon, and afterward, apostatizing, was judicially punished. Falco presently apprehended him, causing him to be hanged, as Matthew Paris writes, but others record that he was burned to ashes. In the year 1230, King Henry III, wanting money, constrained the Jews to say whether they would or would not give him the 3rd part of all their movable goods, and that with all speed. The Jews, in the year of our Lord 1231, built a synagogue very skillfully, but the Christians obtained of the king that it should be dedicated to our Blessed Lady, and it was since by the same King Henry granted to the brethren of St. Anthony of Vienna, and called St. Anthony's Hospital. In the year of our Lord 1233, King Henry III at his own cost built in London, not far from the old temple, a decent house and church sufficient for 392 converts, with other convenient buildings belonging to it, called the House of the Converts, to which house the converted Jews fled, leaving the blindness of Judaism, and under a certain honest rule of living might have appointed allowances, habitation, safe refuge, and sufficient livelihood during their whole lives, without servile labor and the gain of usury. Whereupon it came to pass that in a short time there were gathered together to that place a great number of converts, who were there baptized and instructed in the Christian faith, and lived commendably, being governed by a skillful rector, specially appointed for that purpose, King Henry, in the year 1235. Keeping his court in the Nativity at Westminster with many of his bishops and nobles, there were brought before him upon the complaint of John Tolley's 7 Jews, who had circumcised a certain child in Norwich, whom they had stolen away from his parents and kept for a year apart from the sight of Christians, intending to crucify him on the feast of Easter. But being convicted of this act, they confessed the truth of the matter in the king's presence, and therefore, being at the king's pleasure both for their lives and limbs, were detained in prison for this offense, and some of them were drawn and hanged. In the year of our Lord 1240, the Jews circumcised a Christian child at Norwich, and having circumcised him, they called him Jernain. But afterward they let him go, so that he would be crucified as an insult to Jesus Christ, who was crucified. But the father of the child, from whom the Jews had stolen him, diligently searching for his son, at last found him shut up in the custody of the Jews, and with loud cries declared that his son, whom he believed to have been lost, was wickedly kept hidden in the chamber of a certain Jew. This great, deliberate wickedness, coming to the knowledge of the bishop, William Prynne, a prudent and circumspect man, and of other great men, lest through the slothfulness of the Christians so great an injury to Christ should pass unpunished, all the Jews of the city were apprehended, and when they sought to defend themselves by royal authority, the bishop said that such matters belonged to the church, and were not to be determined in the king's court, since the question to be decided concerned circumcision and the breach of faith. Whereupon 4 of the Jews, being convicted of the aforesaid wickedness, were first dragged about at the tails of horses and then hanged on the gallows, lamentably breathing out the remains of life. The very next year, the Jews in foreign parts, especially in Germany, believing that the Tartars were of their own nation, entered into a secret league with them to destroy the Christians and subdue the whole world to themselves. To this end, they provided many hogsheads filled with arms to be transported to the Tartars, pretending to the Christian princes that they were vessels filled only with poisoned wines, with which they intended to poison and destroy the Tartars who would drink no wine, but such things were devised by the Jews, this treachery being detected by the customers in Germany, who found these supposed vessels of wine to be filled with arms for the Tartars, wherewith to destroy the Christians. The Jews were delivered to the tormentors, to be perpetually imprisoned or slain with their own swords, as Matthew Paris more fully relates. In the year 1243, King Henry exacted a great ransom from the most miserable Jews, both in gold and silver, so that, besides what he exacted from others, he extorted from one Jew, Aaron of York, 4 marks of gold and 4,000 marks of silver. The king himself receiving the gold with his own hand from every Jew, man or woman, being made a king a new receiver of customs. But the silver was received by others for the king. In the year 1244, in August, the corpse of a small male child was found buried in the city of London, with his whole thighs and arms, and under his body there was a regular inscription in Hebrew letters, to which spectacle many resorted, admiring it and not knowing how to read the letters, and knowing that the letters were Hebrew, they called their converted Jews who lived in the house which the king had founded in London, that they, as those who loved their life and members for the honor, love, and fear of their Lord the King, without concealment of falsehood, might declare the writing. For the king's bailiffs and conservators of the peace were present. They likewise believed, neither without cause, that the Jews had either crucified the little child in mockery and contempt of Christ, which was often reported to have happened, or had afflicted him with sundry torments to crucify him. And when he had given up the ghost, they had now cast him there as unworthy the cross. Moreover, there appeared on his body blue marks and rents of rods, and manifest signs and footsteps of some other torment. And when those converts were brought to read the things that were inscribed, and studied that they might perfectly read them, they found the letters deformed and now not legible, being many ways disfigured and defaced, and rubbed down by reason of the extension and contraction of the skin and flesh. But they found the name of the father and mother of the little child, suppressing their surnames, and that the child was sold to the Jews. But to whom or to what end was not known.